We have two really outstanding speakers. And I will introduce the first one, Dr. Gavril Hercz from Humber Hospital. He's an associate professor of medicine. He's a nephrologist by training, a psychoanalyst, and has a lot of insight working with dialysis patient. So he's going to share his experience, and the topic that he's going to address is psychosocial disruption of the pandemic, making sense in retrospect. Gavril?
Thank you, York. So quite a few months ago, Dr. Pace asked me, I really have a sense of the impact of COVID in terms of a lot of losses that we need to integrate. Perhaps you could sort of prepare or maybe, share with us about, coping with loss and mourning. And I thought, that maybe that's not too difficult. And then as I got into it more and more, I realized that actually at this phase, we're still not in a phase where we're able to mourn yet. And I think that, mourning happens when you're able to look in the rearview mirror and appreciate something that has passed. And even though we're sort of in the midst, I guess, at this phase of a lot of denial, the idea that we're done, we had enough of this, time to move on. In many ways, I think we're still in the middle of this process. And so it's still not in the rear view mirror enough that we can sort of undergo a process of mourning and have it sort of recede into the past. So then the question was, what could I talk about? So I guess what I'm hoping to sort of do is maybe start the process of trying to appreciate what's in our side view mirror as we're driving along, realizing that it's still not in the rear view mirror. So let's, I'm not sure, turn on, okay. Okay, I think we're good. So this was around 2.5 years ago when all of a sudden the normality and the continuity of our everyday lives were shattered. And not only did life change externally, going into the hospital, going through security screening, walking down corridors with absence of people, the normal number of patients in terms of families, etc., disappeared. And Humber's a large hospital, and you could walk empty corridors for days and not see anybody. We were sort of estranged from each other. The impact is not only our own environments, but really the dramatic changes that occurred inside of us. All of a sudden, we kind of felt that we were estranged from ourselves. We looked in the mirror and somehow we did not recognize ourselves and wondered what happened all of a sudden. A small version would be, I still remember 9/11, when even though it was something that was localized in New York City, it seems that all of a sudden we were all traumatized. And in many ways, everything changed after that. Security, you have to line up quite a while before. I don't know if you remember going through security at airports prior to 9/11, which was a very quick, easy process. And we have never gone back to the way it was. And I guess that's the other premise I'd like to lay out, that I don't think we'll ever be able to go back to the world the way it was, in as much as we would like to. And wherever we navigate to will be a different world altogether. The other premise that I find interesting, and I think it sort of makes sense, that in many ways, it's not as if we were living in a kind of normal, unchanging life. It felt like that, but there were dramatic shifts occurring in the world around us that we were not really very aware of. And by that, I mean the detriments and the downside of the internet and cyber connection. We're all sort of enamored by the incredible exposure to information, the availability, the connections. But we were actually undergoing a transformation in society. And while that was happening, we also had our own inner transformations. And the issue is that it's very difficult to appreciate the downside of new technology. It's very easy to be enamored by the dramatic positive shifts. It takes time, sometimes decades, to appreciate the downside. And some of the things that have been happening as a result of the process we've been going through prior to COVID, there's this incredible amount of information that's being pushed to us, and yet we have no time to process it. We don't even have time to read the headlines in terms of the news that's sort of pushed to us on a daily basis. And there's this incredible drive to keep up with it. So people are kind of apologizing. I don't know if you are, I mean, I do it sometimes. So I'm sorry I'm replying so late in the evening when I should have been replying maybe 5 hours ago, kind of thing. And the other thing is that we reply very quickly. And there's this inner compunction to reply faster and faster to turn information around, but really to not really an efficient end. And the other thing is that we are more and more available in terms of the information that's reaching us. And what's happening in that process, that we are being sorted into digital tribes. So information is pushed to us that sort of reflects our own perspective because of all the hits that we're doing. And all of a sudden, we keep getting information filtered to us that we say, you know what, I very much agree with this. And this is exactly what I'm so excited and angry or upset about. And so sometimes it's kind of fun to sort of go out of that bubble, and sort of sometimes I enjoy going to Fox News just to see how it makes me feel. And it's interesting how all of a sudden emotional, I feel, yeah, no, they're absolutely right. I can't believe that they're doing this or that. And all of a sudden your whole perspective changes, and yet how seductive the whole process can be. And the other thing is that even though we are connected to so many more and more people, there's much less and less empathy in life around us. We are increasingly isolated, alienated, and lonely. And you can sort of imagine, for example, kids don't go out and play anymore with other kids in the neighborhood. You know, kids are connected on the internet. The nuclear family that's together is, at the same time as they're together, each child has their own cell phone they're connecting globally with an outside world. So everybody's processing their connections in parallel, but also to an outside world simultaneously. The mother who's walking her infant, that infant is now competing for attention with the mom's cell phone. So there's a radical transformation in how we connect with each other. And in that process, I would venture that there's a much less and less empathetic connection, and we are more and more disconnected, even though we feel an immediacy in our connections with the world around us. So in essence, I think that we have sacrificed control of our inner lives for the sake of surfing the outside world and the information that's pushed to us. And I'm trying to lay the groundwork of what happens when COVID hit. This is just an example of Twitter traffic if you look at right-wing, left-wing groups, or Republican, Democrats, etc. And you can see how people, individuals who are tweeting each other and spreading information are basically coalescing into bubbles. And there's very little crossover of connections and information from one side to the other. You know, at least when you pick up a newspaper, you can read different columns that may be sort of diametrically different from each other. When you read the news on Google News, basically you're getting what's pushed to you and what's of interest to you. And all of a sudden you find yourself reading the same perspective over and over again. Sorry. And as a consequence of this, there are other major shifts in society prior to COVID. And I don't know if you remember that prior to COVID, you know, there were increasing polarizations, you know, black and white, good and bad. There was a demonization of Mexicans. We have to, you know, predators, drug gangs, we have to build a wall. We have to keep all the bad people outside because we are all the good people inside. So there was this incredible polarization and demonization of groups within our society, and truth became subjective. There's no such thing as objective truth. If I believe it to be true, then that's what truth is. How bizarre is that? And yet more and more, that's actually becoming the norm in terms of if you look at what's going on around the world. And as a result, there was growing distrust in the social order. And parallel with that, the maldistribution of power, money, etc. I mean, there's the economy of, the upper class, the affluence in America, and the poverty classes. There's a larger and larger spread with almost a disappearance of the middle class. So that's kind of laying the groundwork of what I believe has been happening in society around us, and in some ways perhaps making the impact of COVID so much more dramatic. Now, people who study the psychological aspects of disasters, and this is whether you're looking at hurricanes, tornadoes, ice storm, have also mapped out pandemics, and basically it follows a similar pattern where there's an anticipation of the disaster coming. So, there was something happened in China, and there's this kind of growing apprehension of, is it going to stay in China? Just like, let's say, Ebola is in Central African Republic, Uganda. So is it something that's there? And it's a good thing it's there, good thing it's not us, rather them than us. So there's this kind of anticipation of something that potentially could be moving and hitting us. And so we kind of use aspects of denial to protect ourselves. It's not going to happen. We're here. We're safe. But then suddenly there's an impact and it arrives. And so this is sort of March 2020. It arrives. And I'll speak about the impact of what happens at that point, and maybe just very briefly talk about the heroic phase. If you remember, 6 months into COVID, cowbells for physicians coming home, healthcare workers. There was a glorification, heroic glorification. I still remember, Italian physicians who were looking after COVID patients with no PPE, no equipment, and the high mortality rate of physicians in Italy and nurses during the outbreak. And it kind of upset me a little bit, but it was this sort of heroic description of these physicians. I mean, that how altruistic and how great they are, even though in some ways they were committing suicide. And the unfortunate thing is, to be a true hero, you really have to die. Then you really become a hero. And then the honeymoon phase of, we're all pulling together. We're going to lick this. It's on its way out. All we need is the vaccine, and it's finished. And yet then what happened was it didn't happen. And so we've kind of entered a state of disillusionment, the state of nihilism. And then every time we had a new variant, you see the blip in terms of the emotions going up and down. And I would venture, I don't think the pointer works, but in most disasters, there's a climb out of it. It's like, okay, we're beyond the hurricane. Now we're getting people coming in, rebuilding houses, etc. I would venture that it's more the lighter lines that I drew and I don't know where it's going to go, whether it's we're going to have this sort of up and down partial recovery, or are we in an extended crisis mode? But I would guess that we're at that point where it's a deflection of which way we're heading. And even though there's a desire that we would consider going past it, that we're done with it, and everything is going to get better and optimistic, I am not so sure we're there yet. And this is just a brief reminder. I don't know if anybody, it seems like yesterday, but it seems like decades ago. I don't know if you remember when everything was shut. Churches, people who needed support couldn't access churches, spiritual airplanes were kept flying. I don't know if you remember, there were no passengers, but they said for the sake of the economy and the sake of employing the people in the business, we have to keep flying these planes. And they were flying all over the world, empty, basically. Very surreal. And the sacrifice of the elderly, the high mortality rate in the elderly and the frail and the vulnerable. So the question is now, looking at it, are there any aspects of COVID that sort of make it unique in terms of any other disaster? Certainly, I don't think many of us have ever faced anything like this in our own lives. And so the question is, are there any aspects that make it unique? Certainly, it's the first one that I guess happened in the digital age and the incredible rapidity of information. People actually were tracking the spread of COVID through Twitter traffic and using all kinds of interesting algorithms. So that's very interesting. Very easily transmitted, and the mortality rate and the incredible changes that happen in terms of even some of the suspensions of democratic processes that we kind of took for granted and sort of acquiesced and said, well, that's what's needed in a disaster area. But today, I think we're talking about the psychological response. And in terms of the psychological response, I think it's very important to ascertain that in parallel with the biological transmission, there's also a psychological or societal virus that's being transmitted at the same time. So it's not as if all we have to worry about is the biological illness. At the same time, there's actually a dramatic shift in our own emotional states and in the world around us. And one of the issues in terms of the psychology of pandemics that in many ways the footprint of the psychological impact is actually much larger than the physical impact. And that's not even so much the actual impact as it happens, but also the timing, the temporality. So we may, let's say at this moment, be beyond biological threat of COVID in terms of our own physical health. But I venture for some of us, it may take years to actually recover from the emotional impact of COVID. And that's going to take time to process. And we're not even through or maybe have begun in any ways to cope with that. And also that it created some interesting polarization. There was one segment that fled into this sort of complete denial. People who were in the process of being intubated with COVID, saying, "Well, I don't believe it's COVID. It's just something else completely," and it sort of created a real sense of cognitive dissonance. How can somebody who's at this moment being intubated with COVID still be in denial about it? And then on the other hand, people accepting the incredible anxiety associated with this. And I guess in terms of the forum that we're in, I think it's sort of important to talk to the impact on healthcare workers and how they were affected. On the one hand, there was, for our own sense of integration and continuity, it's very important to be able to carry on in certain activities. It sort of defines us. And so on the one hand, there's a certain advantage in terms of being in the healthcare system because it's a vital employment, and we went to work. We continued working, and there was a certain continuity in terms of our own self-identity and how we saw ourselves. But in that process, there was also increased risk in terms of infections. This was the days before the vaccine was available. And there were all kinds of impacts on us as physicians, as nurses, as healthcare employees. One was the inability to help many people. So basically, a very high mortality rate and the incredible empathy fatigue that occurred. I still remember when, I guess it was mainly UHN, when the nurses needed police escort to get into Toronto General and go to work. Like how surreal is that healthcare workers needed police protection. In certain other countries in Central South America, nurses had lye and other fluids poured on them because they were deemed to be the carriers of COVID and the spreaders of COVID, and people died in that process. So again, showing you the incredible psychological impact on populations coping with this traumatic situation. Many people were fearful of going home and spreading potentially illness. So I spoke to many nurses, for example, who would not go home. They had small infants and they would go live in a motel for weeks at the time when they were working in the hospital. And again, fueling that continuing estrangement from their support base and sort of continuing to be alone. And with time, there was a growing sort of threat and anxiety about overwhelming the system. And I remember being in all kinds of, or having sort of reports, up-to-date reports from Humber on an ongoing basis of, okay, here's this week how we're going to cope with the looming disaster. So we're going to, shut down the ORs. We're going to have patients vented in the operating room. We're going to have patients vented in the recovery room. There was actually a time when they ran out of ICU nurses, and so they were putting out a call for physicians to actually begin to, and many physicians actually did. They actually began working as ICU nurses because there were just not enough nurses to provide care for vented patients. So all kinds of coping mechanisms that in a world prior to COVID, you would say, this is surreal. I don't believe that this could ever happen. I mean, do you remember patients moved around to different cities? We had patients who started at Humber, ended up in Aurelia and Huntsville, and then 3-4 months later repatriated to Humber. I mean, and all of you, I'm sure, have instances and experiences that you were part of that in retrospect would seem quite surreal given the everyday world that we live in. And interesting, curious questions, how safe is it for me? Like, there's an urge for me to look after a patient, but this patient potentially could also be dangerous. What is a safe distance for me in terms of helping a patient? I remember that we had all kinds of emails in the Department of Medicine, for example, that if somebody came through the ER and somebody had listened to their chest already, does it behoove that everybody who does a consultation now has to listen to the patient's chest? Or do we accept the fact that one person has taken the risk of listening and everybody else can rely on that person's physical exam and therefore potentially be safer? There were some other issues that arose, and I can tell you that even up to today, people come up to me, even in the clinic, in terms of the impact of the trauma, and they'll say, you know what, my child has some cough, and it's really brought up, and I had a dream last night, about my sister who passed away when I was younger, and I'm worried about my son. And so it was interesting how spontaneously people would come up and sort of share all kinds of traumatic stories and dreams and nightmares that they were having, as if something was loosened inside. And our own appearance changed. We had these layers. People were actually putting photographs on their chest to sort of personalize who they were. We said, who's that behind? I was always amazed that people would recognize one, even with masks and the shields, etc. But there was a real process of dehumanization. And the dying process became isolated. People in the ICU could not connect with their families as they lay dying. And slowly we began to lose our ability to think, and it became a challenge to kind of keep containing all this tragedy that was happening around us. And unfortunately, also, we were in an environment, certainly in the hospital system, where there's little attention being paid to mental health issues. I think that culture is shifting now in response, but up until then, there was very little of that. And so I think in many ways, we began to see different coping mechanisms. People were afraid of going out. All of a sudden, it was much safer to stay indoors. And I myself remember doing all the nephrology clinics from home and realizing after, wow, I haven't been out in 3-4 days. And how is that even possible that you could just stay indoors your whole life? We became more obsessive. We were sort of, okay, now I remember watching videos. Okay, so I put on my mask. Before I put it on, I wash my hand. I put it on, but now I wash again. But then I have to take off the gown, so I have to wash again. I put on a clean gown, so now I have to wash again. And all of a sudden, it's becoming more and more confusing of, how do you keep safe? And there was a lot of conspiracy theories in terms of where it came from and suppressing that kind of information. The major premise I want to make is that, when COVID came, this is a huge personal trauma. This is not just some minor event that swept through. This is a major traumatic experience that And the nature of trauma is that it pierces or it breaks our ability to make sense of things. It's almost like it kind of creates a certain psychosis in us, that we sort of disconnect with the ability to make sense of it. It was just so overwhelming, it kind of ruptured the dam of our ability to contain it. And so our everyday life of this was yesterday, and here's what I did today, and now the weekend's coming up, and then I can do this. Or if I want to take a week off and I can go to the Caribbean, here's how it works. All these kinds of simplistic steps and processes were thrown by the wayside. And in a way, the continuity of our everyday lives was broken. And that kind of breaking of continuity and predictability and safety and security creates a tremendous amount of anxiety, and it plays all kinds of tricks on our minds. It kind of depletes our resilience. We became more tired. We developed brain fog. We couldn't differentiate one day from the next. It's as if everything became the same. And it's interesting that as you went around, like, people just spontaneously started telling you stories. So this was a lady that was, stays with her husband during dialysis, and she was saying, it's amazing that all these years I never thought about it, and I never spoke to anybody about it. But I remember when we had polio in Toronto, I don't know, around maybe 50, 60 years ago, I had a neighbor. There was a little girl that I used to play with all the time, and one day she wasn't there. And nobody spoke about it. We went on as if nothing happened, and yet I'm sure that she died from polio. And it's strange that after all these years, now with COVID, this has come into my mind. And so one of the other aspects of trauma is that it wakes up older layers of traumas that have been deposited, locked into a closet. We've kind of rarely visited those areas. We never went into those rooms. The problem is with the current trauma, it kind of loosened up the defenses. It loosened up the boundaries where we were able to lock something away. And not only are we dealing now with the current trauma and the impact and the anxiety of staying safe and making sense, it woke up all these older memories. The secretary was talking about her sister who died, maybe 30 years ago. And this kind of reawakening of older traumas, it kind of enhances the current trauma and kind of creates this kind of feedback loop, and it's kind of just enhances it and it creates more and more anxiety. And that's one of the things we're dealing with. And the other thing is that the nature of trauma is that we are trapped in an everlasting present. It's kind of like Groundhog Day. We just keep reliving each day, and it's as if we cannot get past it. Every day we go in, we may have our anxiety, we may feel burnt out. Everybody around us is sort of dragging themselves. People are carrying on the surface, but inside, everybody is carrying a major load and dealing with an ongoing daily anxiety that we have no idea why it's there, and we don't know when it's going to leave us. And we wish it would. We wish we could just go out and live our lives, but somehow we cannot get past it. And so we live in this daily fog and daily anxiety. And our relationship to our bodies has changed. Even though there's this threat that's outside of us, all of a sudden we became very suspicious of our bodies. I mean, with my wife on a daily basis, oh, I have a little cough. Do you think it's COVID? Or I have a little sniff. Oh, my joints are aching. Do you think it's COVID? I went and did a COVID test. I mean, how many of us have sort of become, hypochondriacal because it's almost as if we cannot trust our own bodies. Our bodies have become the enemies where the threat now has begun to reside in. And there's this kind of sense of insecurity in terms of what is happening with our bodies. And similarly, not only are these changes happening within us, but obviously there are major societal changes happening. Look at the movement to autocracy. So one of the major fuels for this traumatic sense is that it takes us back to early phases of helplessness. And the more helpless that we feel in the face of this huge disaster, the more it fuels the trauma that's happening at this time. And so the tendency when you are faced with helplessness is to move towards strong autocratic leadership. And look at how many places around the world, sort of Brazil, United States, etc., have moved to and accepted this movement to an autocratic leadership. Normally, we would never do that. I will briefly look at, I don't know if you remember the heroic phase when, we're going to go into the fire and we're all together, and irrespective of how dangerous it is, we are going to do it. And so many people have died, healthcare workers, nurses, doctors, in the face of inadequate supplies. And so the premise I'm making is that we are still in this area of disillusionment, where everything stands still. We were hoping that things would change, but every day kind of wakes up to, okay, there's a new variant, or there's this, and there's that, and there's a new outbreak, and there's a new lockdown, etc. And so we are actually all very tired of this. I don't want to make this too much of a negative talk, so it's always important to have something positive. It brings me, Sartre. Sartre was a French philosopher in Paris, World War II. When the Nazis occupied Paris, he made a very interesting comment. Never were we freer than under German occupation. It doesn't make sense. How does he see that? One of the interesting things is that prior to COVID, we were trapped into all kinds of activities and that we never really paid attention to. Okay, it's Friday afternoon, so we have to do this. It's Saturday morning, we have to do this, and we never thought about it. All of a sudden, all this was swept away. And what we did, we actually had to think about it and make a choice and make a decision. And interestingly, the more you think about what you're undertaking, what you're planning to do, in some ways you actually feel freer. And I still remember trying to sort of create an ambience for our children to visit in the middle of November or December to have dinner in the backyard. And I said, how surreal that we're having dinner in November in the backyard, Canadian winter. And yet, how one savors and remembers those moments of connection. And I think that perhaps that's one of the gifts of what we're going through is this savoring of that interpersonal connection and how valuable it is and how easily it is to lose it. I only have a few minutes left, so I won't spend too much time. That in a way, this is, I think, what we're looking forward to is coming out. And I think coming out will allow a mourning process to occur, which will require aspects of commemoration, and it will need aspects of resiliency building. The caveat I leave in terms of the healthcare culture and emotional illness in our hospitals, there's a stigmatization of support for emotional illness in our healthcare system. Certainly for physicians, there's a stigma that you're not supposed to get ill. If you do get ill, keep it to yourself, keep it a secret, find your own help. And so I think that's an issue because there's such a tremendous amount of burnout. Some people say there's a 70 to 80% burnout rate currently amongst physicians and nurses in our healthcare system. And I've never seen so many nurses retire en masse as, for example, during this year. So I think that's the end of my talk. Thank you.